All right, so what I've done is I've asked ChatGPT to give me 3 debated topics in the areas of health and fitness and nutrition. And I want to give you some clarity on what some of these things might hold for you, because there's a lot of debate out there. There's not any scientific proof of any one specific thing when we really get into the weeds of some of this stuff. Like, what is the perfect diet? What is the perfect exercise program? We don't know for sure based on science, right? We've got beliefs, we've got ideas, we've got thoughts, I've got frameworks. And the reason that I'm going to go through this stuff, and that maybe why you should listen to me, is because I'm going to look at this from the lens of in the trenches experience. Because I've been in the trenches working with so many different people over the last 25 years, testing and playing and working with a lot of this stuff and having a lot of conversations with a lot of really smart people who have also been in the trenches and have tried many of these things. So my insight really comes from the trenches, right? Science is very unclear. I love science. I think it's great, but we have a lot of work to do there. So again, let's look at this from the lens of what works, what doesn't in the real world. So the first thing we've got is the optimal diet debate. Is it low carb keto, or is it high carb? And let's look at this from the lens of fat loss, because that's what most people are trying to do right now, is lose some excess body fat. So I do know this. If you tend to follow low carb keto, and keto is really just the extreme end of low carb, think of keto as basically being zero carb, right? And I consider the keto low carb thing to almost be 2 separate diets. So even though ChatGPT is lumping them together, they're 2 completely different things. So I do know that when we get someone who has been really eating a poor diet full of a lot of processed refined carbohydrates, if we take those highly processed refined carbohydrates out of the diet, most of the time they're going to lose weight. And it happens rather quickly. Now, the thinking is a lot of this is water weight, which there is some indication that could be, because I have seen people who would go into a ketogenic diet or into a low carb diet, lose a bunch of weight really fast, like within the first few days, but then gain it all back if they fall off the wagon, right? If they go back to normal eating, that weight comes back very, very quickly. So that leads me to believe that it's likely not going to be fat. Now, here's the other thing. If you stick with a low carb diet or the ketogenic diet, again, 2 different things, if you stick with either one of those for a longer period of time, then I think there is a better chance of those fat cells in your body. If you think of all of your fat as little cells, they're like little balloons, and there's like 1 trillion of them, probably more than 1 trillion. There's all these little cells, they're like balloons, and they fill up. Over time, if we low carb, those balloons get a little bit small, right? They start to release some of their cargo, and you become a little bit more what we call metabolically flexible. What does that mean? It just means that you're able to burn fat for energy very efficiently, just like you're able to burn carbohydrates very efficiently, right? And if you've been relying on just primarily carbohydrates for energy for the majority of your life, which most of us have, then it can be very uncomfortable to get yourself to burn fat for energy, right? So again, I think there's some value there. It's very uncomfortable. Is it natural to be low carb? I think it's natural to be low carb, but I don't think it's natural to be ketogenic, okay? And let's just be really clear on what ketogenic means. So a lot of people claim to be on or tried keto, or maybe they've told me that they're on a ketogenic diet. And the first question I always have is, are you actually measuring your ketones? Like, do you have a tester? And you can buy a tester on Amazon for like $40, and you can get an exact measurement of what level of ketosis you're actually in. And what does that tell you? Well, it tells you how much your body is utilizing fat for energy, just to keep it very simple, right? If there's some things that happen and it turns it into ketones, which your body can run on very, very efficiently. So if you're really trying to be more, let's say, fat adapted, if you want to get your body to run off of fat very efficiently, you have to go full ketogenic, and you have to do it for a good period of time. The thing is, it's very uncomfortable, and I would argue that it's not even that sustainable. The only person I know that is stuck with a ketogenic diet, like testing every single day, the longest they could make it was 3 years. And after 3 years, they brought carbs back into their life. So I don't think it's necessarily a lifestyle. The low carb, I think you can make a lifestyle, but it's going to be, you're likely never going to get into a true ketogenic state. Now, the reason in my opinion, the reason to get into a true ketogenic state is for someone who is maybe a type 2 diabetic, or someone that's been a type 1 diabetic for a long period of time and they're not managing their health very well. They're not managing their sugar. They're relying on insulin a lot, right? So again, if you're type 2 or type 1 and you're not able to manage well, that's where I think the therapy of a true ketogenic diet might come in handy, right? Where, and I say the word therapy because I look at something like the ketogenic diet not as something natural that we should be doing forever, but as a therapy to sort of shift your body away from just processing carbohydrates so much. Like, let's shift away from that. Let's get your body burning fat for energy a little bit more efficiently so that you don't have to rely on carbs all the time. Now, your body is always going to have some carbohydrates because your body just naturally makes it. It stores it. It's always there. So even if you don't eat it, you're still going to have some carbohydrates running through the system, but you can shift that pendulum over pretty dramatically. And I think there's a lot of value there. And I've seen a lot of value there for people, again, who are diabetic. So hopefully that makes sense. Is high carb good for fat loss? I think if you're going to do the high carb, this is again my experience, if you're going to go high carb, I think quality matters. You have to be very careful not to eat a bunch of junk food because most of the carbohydrates are the tastiest and not the most healthful. You can really consume a lot of carbohydrates and it can make you very fat very, very quickly. So I would say if you're really trying to lose fat, and you want to do a high carb, you're going to have to dramatically reduce your calories. The cool thing about doing a low carb is you generally, in my experience, you don't have to reduce your calories by very much. You just have to avoid a lot of the processed refined carbohydrates and it'll work. So both of them work. I think the most helpful way to do this is to go more low carb. And here's what we do in my coaching program, Athletic After 40. The prescription that I give for my clients is meat, veggies, nuts, seeds, and fruit. Meat, veggies, nuts, seeds, and fruit. If you can choose to eat the majority of your foods from those categories, from one or more of those categories, you're going to be just fine. And depending on how much fruit you eat, you can be either high carb or low carb. Now, I don't think eating a bunch of fruit is necessarily a great idea, but I do think fruit is essential if you're a healthy person, especially if you're an active person. So that's a way to sort of think of approaching your nutrition in a way that's not putting you in a ketogenic state. It's not necessarily committing yourself to being low carb or high carb, but it is giving you an opportunity to eat some really high quality foods, which is foods from Mother Nature, meat, veggie, nuts, seeds, and fruit. That's where you should get your carbs from. So there's my thinking on that and how we sort of approach it in Athletic After 40. All right, so let's talk about number 2. So the second thing we've got is functional training. So the second thing that we've got is the cardio conundrum. Is steady state cardio a waste of time? Interesting. So there's been a debate out there. Should we be doing long distance zone 2, which is kind of the latest and greatest way of labeling low intensity cardio? Should we be doing that to get in great shape? Or should we maybe be focusing more on HIIT training, high intensity interval training? And it's funny how over the years that I've been in this industry, I've seen this pendulum kind of swing back and forth. And now it's swinging back to cardio. Back in like the 80s, 90s, there was a big push for cardio respiratory endurance. Like running became really popular. Triathlons were coming out, biathlons, like the fittest people in the world were the triathletes. Like that became a big craze for a very, very long time. And it lasted maybe 10, 15 years. And then it kind of switched over to high intensity interval training. And now I see it trending back the other direction. So here's what we know, and here's been my experience. There's value in both. So first and foremost, if you just want to be a healthy, active person, you need both. You need to sometimes be able to work at a high intensity without dying, right? So most people who only train long duration, low intensity cardio, whenever they're tasked with something very challenging with like a sprint distance kind of event, they get destroyed, okay? Now, the same thing happens sort of for the folks who do a lot of high interval training. If I tell someone who's only been doing, let's say 15 minutes or less or 20 minutes or less high intensity interval training type workouts to go out and do something like a marathon, they're going to suffer. But they don't suffer as much as their counterparts, right? So here's the interesting thing. If you do high intensity interval training, there is a good carryover to the longer duration stuff. Okay. If you only do long duration, low intensity stuff, there is not a good carryover to high intensity stuff. So neither one would be ideal. You want both, right? You definitely want to have both. But if you're going to just do one thing and you are time strapped, do the low intensity or do the high intensity stuff, right? Mix in low intensity when you can, when you have the time, but prioritize. If you're looking from this from a time management standpoint, you're going to get more bang for your buck doing the high intensity interval training. That's going to carry over better to the long duration stuff. Again, whereas long duration does not carry over into the short duration, high intensity stuff. I can't tell you how many people who have been great runners, great bikers, triathletes who I've had come into my gym over the years, and we've done different tests, different things with them. And sometimes I will challenge them to do something very high intensity, and they'll be in the back throwing up because their body just wasn't adapted to it. Whereas, again, doing the high intensity stuff, going to the long duration stuff, those people generally gas out, but they can usually get through it, right? You can kind of push yourself through some of those longer duration stuff. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Again, value for both. Your time. If you don't have a lot of time, definitely focus on the high intensity stuff. If you got time, do both. All right, let's talk about the third topic we've got here. So the third one is the recovery revolution. Are rest days overrated or underrated? Now, I work primarily nowadays with guys over 40. I'm 49, so my target clientele are guys who are in my age group. And there's this thinking that you have to rest more, you have to recover more, you have to be a little bit more careful as you get older. Now, I think there's certainly some evidence to that, but I also have a significant amount of evidence that doesn't really support that. I think that we kind of underestimate the potential that we have as humans, especially as we get older. And I would even argue younger people too. Like, I think there's been this big push for recovery over the last, let's say, 5 or 10 years. But I think we're almost overdoing it. You know, we're putting everybody in saunas, Normatec boots, and cold plunges in the name of recovery, where we're taking away from some valuable training that we could be doing, right? We're almost, I feel like, again, the pendulum is kind of swung over to focusing more on recovery rather than actually doing the work. Okay. And here's kind of the debate. Like, if you work too hard, your risk of injury goes up. If you overtrain, you will see you're more susceptible to getting sick. Your immune system doesn't function as well. Your performance goes down, and all that stuff is true. So I think there's a right way and a wrong way to approach your training. And if you program correctly, like I do programming for a living, like I program for all kinds of different people. And when I'm programming, I have to make sure the dosage is correct. If I overdo it, I can certainly overtrain anyone, whether they're 70 years old or they're 20 years old. I can auger anyone into the ground. But if I'm careful and I do this the right way, I can get 70-year-old guys to work out at a relatively high intensity pretty much every single day without all of those overtraining side effects. So again, I think there's some nuance to this. Everybody's a little bit different. There is a way for you to train yourself. You have way more potential than what you may think. You still need to sleep at night. You still need to take care of yourself. You need to eat well, all those kinds of things. So we have to kind of factor those things in as well. But if you do a lot of that stuff right, and if you live a very healthy lifestyle, you would be amazed at how hard you can train day in and day out. And I used to work with Olympians. Olympians train incredibly hard day in and day out, but they've worked themselves up to that spot. Right? So it's not something I would recommend just for someone just coming in off the street or someone who's just been a leisure exerciser for a number of years. You have to build yourself up. And there's a way to do that we can't even really get into here. It's kind of like an art and a science, and it's a conversation that needs to go on between coach and client for you to really kind of dial this in. But what I found is, like, my older guys, they actually really enjoy training almost every single day. Believe it or not, like, I got a 71-year-old guy who literally trains every day, and he's working out fairly intensely every single day. And we do it in a way that just works for him. And he just feels better when he gets that dose, when he feels that intensity. He likes that, and it makes his life better. So we found a way to make that work. All right. So there it is. I think again, the pendulum is kind of swung over. I don't think we need to be as careful as what I think a lot of people are talking about right now. It's almost, people almost brag about the recovery more than they brag about their actual exercise routine, where back in my day, we used to brag more about what we were doing for exercise than what we were doing for recovery.